Exposure pyramid. One of the key things when it comes to photography, I know I have kept it in the end. This is very important section in this particular video, and this is also very important thing that you need to learn when it comes to taking photographs, or for that matter even when it comes to filmmaking. This is something which we'll see in a different video in the coming weeks, wherein we'll talk about what is an exposure and how is an exposure achieved. So let's have a look at it from a photography perspective. You might have heard this phrase quite often, things like exposure triangle. But I have used the phrase exposure pyramid because what is exposure when there is no fourth variable, which is one of the key variable, which is light. Now, what are the other three variables, you might ask? These are your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, or also pronounced as ISO. These are the three key elements, or rather I would go on and say these are the four key elements that are required to get an image, a proper well exposed correct image what you're photographing. These are the key settings which you need to learn and, like, say, practice enough so that you master exposure and you know how to control, or you know how to read the scene and get the accurate exposure as soon as you pick up the camera. So we will have a look at it one by one. We'll see what is an aperture, what is shutter speed, what is ISO, and how it impacts light, and what are the things it controls. So let's have a look at it one by one basis. First of all, aperture. Aperture is basically the opening in your lens. So if you actually see the front element of the lens, there is a small opening. This is the opening through which light passes through it and it hits the sensor where it is eventually getting captured. So the opening is what is known as aperture. So you might have seen on the lenses, which say like f1.8 lens, f2.8 lens, this is the maximum opening that a lens can be shot at. You might have also have seen things like f2.8, f4, f8, or f11 or f16 getting displayed on the top dial of your camera when you're changing certain settings, or probably when you're shooting auto mode, you might see like the photograph got taken in say f7.1 at the shutter speed of 1 by 250. You might be wondering what are this f2.8, f4, and things like that. This is basically the aperture, the opening in the lens, which you can control on your camera. So basically you can close the aperture or you can open the aperture. When it comes to opening of the aperture, the maximum of which is controlled by the type of lens that you're using. Like if we say f2.8 lens, you can open the aperture up to f2.8 and nothing beyond it. So this is an opening which will allow the light to come and hit the sensor. So the amount of light that you want to control, that you want to reach to the sensor, is controlled by aperture. You can close down the aperture and you can make less light fall on the sensor. You can open the aperture full completely wide and you can have more light reach the sensor. We are talking about what aperture does, what is an aperture, and light hitting the sensor. But aperture also controls one more variable, which is depth of field. So now what is depth of field? Depth of field is the region of focus of the subject what you're photographing. If you're shooting at say something like f1.8, then you have what is known as a shallow depth of field. A very less region of the subject is in focus. Something like if you're photographing a person's face and if you're shooting it at say f1.8, and if you're focusing on the eye, then everything behind their ears is out of focus, and things in front of them, if there is any subject which is there in front of them, is out of focus. But whereas if you're shooting a subject in say f8 or f11 or probably even f22, you have what is known as wider depth of field, which is you have more region in focus. And this is exactly what is controlled by aperture. It's not just the amount of light that is going and hitting the sensor, it's also the depth of field which is actually controlled by your aperture. You can see the illustration on the screen. If you see in the bottom right hand corner the person waving hand, and if it is shot at f1.4, you can see that the background is blur and it is clean and you can see the subject very clearly. But as you increase your aperture to say f4 or f11 or probably even to f22, you can see that more and more of the background is coming into picture. Say like you can see the mountains behind the person coming into picture. This is exactly what I told you. If you have a smaller aperture which is related to a smaller f number, say f1.2, f1.4 or something like that, then you have a smaller region in focus and the background is blur. But whereas if you have a bigger aperture, which is designated by numbers like f16 or f22, then you have a wider depth of field and you have everything from the front of the camera to the back, which is in focus. Now, based on the situation that you are shooting, based on the subject that you are shooting, you need to judge the type of aperture that you want. Say like if you want to shoot portraits or if you want to shoot images of birds or mammals wherein you want the subject to be tack sharp and everything behind it to be out of focus or what we call as bokeh, then you need to use lower aperture, which also mean that you're letting in more light to come and hit the sensor. We'll come back and see how to control this amount of light that is hitting the sensor at a later point. But just keep in mind that if you're shooting subject wherein the background blur is of more importance to you, then you have to use a lower aperture. But say if you're shooting a landscape or if you're shooting architecture wherein the maximum depth is what you require, then you shoot at a higher aperture, which is say like f16 or f22. Keep in mind that the lens diffraction also plays a very critical role in image quality, especially when you're shooting at f22 or something higher than that. So, as much as possible, try to stick to somewhere around f11 or f16, even when you're shooting landscape or even things like architecture. Now, let's have a look at two quick examples to demonstrate this smaller aperture and wider aperture. In this particular scene, you can see a dragonfly sitting on a stick. This image was shot using f2.8 on a 300 mm lens, and you can see that the region between the dragonfly's head and almost to the end of its body, not the tail part, but the end of body is in focus. Its wings are also in focus. So considering the fact that this image was shot using f2.8, I'm getting the background, which was predominantly grass, which was there in that region, as out of focus, and it's coming as a very clean background. And this also resulted in me getting the tail region of the dragonfly as out of focus. But my main importance, the main attention factor here was the dragonfly's head and the wings. So I have got that in focus. The f2.8 has ensured that the background is very clean and uniform. If the same image was shot at say f11 or f22, then I would have probably seen the entire background wherein I could see the grass or even the rocks which were present in the scene. Now let's look at the other way around. If you see this scene, this is a very typical scene in Ladakh, which is there in northern India again. Right from the front of the camera, which is the road, all the way up to the back, which is say mountains and even the clouds. Everything is in focus and it's in tack sharp. This is a image which was shot at f16. So f16 ensured me that I got everything from the road to the mountains and the sky, everything in focus and sharp. So this is typical example, as I told you. Landscape and architecture are something which you typically shoot at a higher aperture, and things like portraits or things like wildlife are what typically you shoot in lower aperture. So you need to choose your aperture based on the subject that you are shooting. Say in this case of this landscape, what I'm photographing, and if I wanted to say photograph a very tiny subject, say like I wanted to emphasize on a small subject which is there on the center of the road and I want the background to be blur, exactly same situation, I would have used a narrow aperture, say like f2.8, and shot it so that the mountains in the background are rendered blur, and my emphasis is more on the subject which is in the center of the frame, not the background. But considering the fact that I wanted this scene to be sharp from the front of the lens all the way up to the back, which is the mountains, I opted to choose this image at f16. Now let's have a look at the second variable, which is shutter speed. Shutter speed is again one of the variables which is used to control light which is hitting the sensor. Shutter speed is basically the shutter which is present in front of your sensor. All cameras have sensors, obviously, that's what make an image. But in good old days, we had films. So there is a shutter curtain which is present in front of your sensor or the film, which opens and closes for a duration which is defined by shutter speed. So you might have seen numbers like 1 by 250th, which we saw as an example sometime back, or you might have seen numbers like 1 by 1000 or even half a second or 1 second. This is a duration for which the shutter is open and allowing the light to hit the sensor. Now let's go step by step. Aperture controls the amount of light that is coming through the lens, and shutter speed controls the duration for which the light is captured on the sensor. Okay, so shutter speed, if you have a faster shutter speed, then the shutter opens and closes very quickly, which means that the less amount of light is captured on the sensor. If you have kept the shutter open for too long, that's when more light information is captured by the sensor. Now, if you have been having a look at the screen, you might have noticed that also written the second factor which the shutter speed controls, which is freezing the motion. Just like aperture, which control the amount of light hitting the sensor and also depth of field, shutter speed also controls the amount of light being captured by the sensor along with freezing the motion. So if you're shooting action sports, or if you're shooting say like birds which are flying, or if you're shooting something like motorsports and things like that, you need faster shutter speed so that you can capture the frame at the precise moment when it happens. So these are the situations wherein you need faster shutter speed. So when we say faster shutter speed, we are talking about values like 1 by 500th of a second, 1 by 1000th of a second, or probably even 1 by 4000. And advanced cameras even gives you an option of 1 by 8000 of a second. So the shutter is open for a very brief moment of time, and the action that is happening in front of the camera is captured at a very precise moment. But contrary to that, if you want to capture the motion that is happening in front of the frame, typical examples being you want to capture the silky smooth flow of water in a waterfall scene, or you want to capture light trails of a traffic, or for that matter, even the astrophotography, those are the situation wherein you use slower shutter speed. So until the duration wherein the shutter is open, all the action that is happening in front of your camera is captured. So let's have a look at this illustration that we have on the bottom right of the screen. So if you can see in the top left corner, it shows a situation wherein the shutter speed is say 1 by 500th of a second, wherein the subject who is probably running is captured still, and there is no motion blur or anything that is happening. It's a tack sharp image with absolutely no motion which is being captured in the frame. But when it goes slower, like you come to 1 by 30th or 1 by 8th of a second, or probably even half a second, that's exactly the point wherein the sensor is getting more time to capture what is happening in front of the camera. And if the person is moving or if the person is running, the motion is what is captured in front of the camera. So if you want to depict a motion, if you want to show the flow of motion, you use slower shutter speed. If you want to capture a scene wherein you want to freeze the action, you use faster shutter speed. Let's have a look at a couple of examples. This is a scene of a fighter jet which was shot in Bangalore in the air show in one of the previous years. So you know that when a fighter jet is flying, it is traveling at the speed of sound, or probably sometimes even more than double the speed of sound. Say like you want a very tack sharp image of the jet which is flying in the sky. These are the situation wherein you use higher shutter speed, like 1 by 1000 or 1 by 4000. This particular photo was shot in 1 by 4000 of a second. In that way, I could get a sharp and a still subject when it is flying. But the same thing, if I had shot in a slower shutter speed, then I would have got it as a streak which is going across the frame, and I would have probably not been able to convince you that it was a fighter jet, and it would have looked like a gray strip in the frame. As I told you, waterfalls are one of the subjects which wherein you can use slower shutter speed. So if you can see on the screen, the left half of the frame has an image which was taken with a slightly faster shutter speed, and you can notice it in the water region that you can see the water is frozen at that particular moment. But when it comes to the right hand side of the image, you can see the silky smooth water flow. This was achieved by using a slower shutter speed, and thereby during the course of the period when the shutter was open, the flow of the water got captured, and you can get that white silky motion in the water. Now you might have understood how photographers get this silky smooth water flow in waterscape or even in oceans and things like that. So a slower shutter speed is what typically used in such situations so that we can capture the motion of the water. So now you know when to use faster shutter speed and when to use slower shutter speed. Keep in mind when you're using faster shutter speed, you're allowing less light to be captured by the sensor. When you're using slower shutter speed, you're allowing more light to be captured by the sensor. Let's look at the third and the most important variable, which is ISO. ISO is basically sensitivity of the sensor. In the good old film days, you would have noticed the film rolls used to come in 100 ASA, 200 ASA, 400 ASA, and 800 ASA. These are basically films with different sensitivity settings. Similar in the case of digital world, we use what is known as ISO. You would have seen values such as 100 ISO, 200 ISO, 400 ISO, all the way up to gazillion ISOs in some of the cameras by Sony. There are certain cameras which can give you even lower values, like Nikon gives you an ability to shoot with 64 ISO, and there are certain Canon cameras which can shoot at 50 ISO. But for the sake of this particular video, we'll consider a very typical, generally available cameras where most of the cameras start with say around 100 ISO and probably go up to say 6400 ISO or even 12800 ISO. ISO is, as I told you, is the sensitivity of the sensor. Lesser the sensitivity, lesser is the light gathering ability of the sensor. Higher the ISO, higher is the light gathering ability of your sensor. Now, the less and more is designated by values. 100 ISO corresponds to the sensor being less sensitive. A higher ISO, like say 6400, means the sensor is more sensitive. So, if you want to capture less amount of light, you use lesser ISO. If you want to capture more light, you use higher ISO. Just like the other two variables, which is aperture and shutter speed, ISO also has a second variable. So unlike depth of field and freezing of motion when it comes to aperture and shutter speed respectively, for the ISO, it's sort of like a negative thing that we have. The factor that ISO controls is called digital noise. Digital noise are the grainy pattern that you get to see on an image when you have used higher ISO. Yes, that's exactly the point. So if you push your ISO beyond a certain point, what the camera can handle, it introduces what is known as digital noise. These are the grainy patterns or even the color noise. There are basically two types of noise which is available, which is luma noise and the color noise. So this is what gets introduced into your image when you're using higher ISO. So you need to be very choosy about when or when not to use higher ISO, and you need to know the impact that it has. So like unlike the aperture and shutter speed, the ISO, the impact of the second variable of the ISO is something not favorable. So you need to be very selective about when you want to use IRI. So you can see the illustration on the bottom right of your screen. An image which is shot at say 50 ISO is very clean. The subject is rendered very sharp and clean. But whereas you try to push your ISO to say beyond 800, 3200, or probably even 12800, you can see that graininess coming into the picture, and it basically also spoils the sharpness of the image. Noise is something which you can probably go and try to tweak and reduce using post processing software, but not all noise reduction softwares are very efficient in removing noise which are introduced by camera when they are being used with very high ISO. So the image ends up being looking very plasticky and flat, and it loses the detail. So as much as possible, try to avoid using very high ISO until and unless the situation demands for it. So the situation wherein you might need higher ISO is when you're shooting indoor and there's absolutely no light available, or the ambient light is very low and you probably don't have a flash that you can use. Things like astrophotography, you want to capture star trails and things like that, that's also a situation wherein you might want to use higher ISO. There was a situation wherein a documentary that we were working on in Gujarat a few years back, it was shot completely in the night, and it was shot in Bhuj in Gujarat, and we were shooting landscape at night. It's literally like in the middle of the night we were shooting landscape, and using of external light was absolutely not something which we could do for the particular documentary, and we were shooting everything in moonlight. So that's exactly a situation wherein we had to push our cameras beyond a permissible range. So we were using a Sony camera which had, like as I told you, ISO which can go up to few lakhs. So the camera was pushed beyond a certain limit so that we can get all the information that is happening in front of us. In such situation, camera can capture things which even your naked eye can't do it, which might look a little bit strange, but those are the situations wherein you use high ISO. Things might look very clean and good on the tiny 3-inch LCD screen on the back of your camera, but the moment you bring back the photos or say probably even the videos onto a bigger monitor, that's when the things start showing up. And especially if it is image and if you want to print it, then it's an absolute no for shooting images with very high ISO. So try to learn what is the limitation of your camera when it comes to ISO. If it's a basic SLR, if it's an entry level SLR, I would say cap your higher ISO limit to say like 800 or probably even 1600, not beyond that. The medium range DSLRs or probably the pro DSLRs can shoot like 3200 or 6400 with not at all introducing any noise at all. But having said that, it's not everybody can afford a 1DX Mark II or an Nikon D5 and things like that. So try to stick to the lower ISO as much as possible. The best way to do it is shoot different scene in different ISOs, like shoot indoor in say from 100 ISO to say like 6400 ISO, and see what is the breaking point of your camera when it comes to introducing noise. Do the same thing, like shoot outdoor scenes, shoot indoor scenes at low light, and see what is the breaking point, and go probably one step below the breaking point to ensure that you have a clean image to work with. Let's have a look at one simple example when it comes to ISO. As I told you, high ISO can be used when you want to photograph at night, especially in astrophotography. This is a very old photograph of mine. This was shot using a basic DSLR, and this was shot at middle of the night, wherein we wanted to capture the meteor trails in the outskirts of Bangalore. The watchtower is being lit by a torch. We did a bit of light painting when we were shooting this image, but this was shot at a very high ISO. So if you bring this image into a post-processing software and if you increase the exposure, you can see here on top of the watchtower or on towards the left where there is trees and all, you can see this grainy pattern which has got introduced, the red or the magenta blotchiness which you can see on top of the watchtower. And this is what gets introduced when you try to use higher ISO, which is beyond whatever is the permissible limit on your cameras for a good image. So these are your three main exposure variables, which is aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, along with a second set of variables that it controls, which is depth of field, freezing motion, and the digital noise. Based on this is what you go ahead and create an image. You get an exposure value. The camera helps in getting that exposure value, and you control that exposure based on these three variables to get a final image.